All right. So, welcome to Borrando el Stigma podcast, the Racist Stigma podcast. I am with Dr. Claudia Mejia, who is a licensed psychologist here in Nevada as well. And before I let her introduce herself, I'm going to introduce myself briefly. My name is Dr. Sandra Gray. I am a licensed psychologist also in Nevada, and I am your host for Borrando el Stigma. We're going to start talking today on our first episode about the new Salinas series on Netflix. And about the overall impact that Selena had on our lives as a first gen or second gen Latinx individual. And just overall talk about the series, dissecting it from a psychological perspective. So today we'll be talking about episode 1, taking a look at the psychological issues, the mental health implications that come up in each series. So if you haven't watched or binge watched the Selena series like I have, do that so that you can watch our episodes and go with us. We're hoping to also in the future dissect other series like Gentified, but dissecting some of those series and looking at some of the Latinx issues and factors that we experience, not only as a culture, but as bicultural folks, right? Because we're, at least for me personally, I'm Mexican American. I identify as a Chicana, and I say Chicana with an X because I'm all about decolonizing not only my mind, but mental health in general. So I'm going to give it over to Dr. Claudia Mejia so she can introduce herself to us, and then we'll jump into the conversation about this series.
Thank you. So I'm very, very excited to have this conversation because one, it's kind of in the mainstream right now, obviously, but also it's been part of our lives, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how we were introduced to her early on. But like some that you mentioned, I'm a psychologist here in Las Vegas. I've been living in lots of different parts of the country, primarily areas where there's a high Latino population. So I was born in Chicago, moved to San Antonio, Texas, and did my internship in Miami, Florida, and then landed here in Las Vegas. And so all of those are big hubs for Latinx folks. And even within that, the cultures are so different. So I'm also Mexican American. I identify as Latina. I'm in that kind of journey of decolonization as well, and really trying to dissect who I am, but also I think more than anything, appreciate who I am from all of the influences, both from where I've lived, but also from my family's background.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, part of those influences, like we're here talking today, right, is like Selena and seeing someone that was like us growing up and just seeing someone that we resonate with, that we can relate to, that is now like, at least at that point in our life was before her death, was crossing over into like mainstream culture. And so similar to you, I grew up, I was born in LA. I lived there until I was about 7 years old and then relocated here with my parents for work, like in 91. And growing up here, I grew up on the east side of town, which is predominantly Latinx, predominantly African American. And so growing up in kind of our own little world too, because I feel like when we have those hubs, right, where most Latinx folks are, we have so much influence from the culture, right, from carnicerias to, you know, tire shops that, you know, are Latinx owned. And so seeing a lot of the language, even like on billboards, was where I grew up as well. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that. And so you're from Texas. And so tell me a little bit about, you know, how Selena impacted your life, when or how she came about in your, even, you know, in your thought process. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I was born in Chicago and we moved to Texas when I was 8 years old. So it was right around the time, a little bit after Selena's death. So my first like real memory of her, I have a very, very vivid memory of being in gym class. I'm in second grade. We're like in the basement gym in Chicago. It's like cold. I got my sweats on, those high tops, and somebody comes up to me and was like, "Oh, did you hear Selena died?" And I'm like 7 years old, right? So I'm like, it wasn't as like emotionally impactful at that time, but I was like, oh, like, whoa. I've never had a like serious tie to like celebrity in that sense, but that moment was impactful because he was like, oh, this person who we've danced to, we've sung to, is now gone, right? And so I remember kind of just that image and that moment. And then when we moved to Texas at San Antonio, there was, I think, a bigger presence being so close. I think it's like 3 hours from Corpus, where she was, where they have a museum for her and everything. So that was a big part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember I'm a little bit older than you, right? Like not too much older, but I'm a little bit older than you. But I remember even in like fourth grade before she died, you know, like we had this like talent show at Albert Edwards Elementary, where I went to school on the east side of town here. And we, you know, I sang, we danced, and a few of my cousin and a few of her friends who I'm still in contact with today, like they, you know, they did a dance routine to Como la Flor, right? And back then, you know, our neighborhood wasn't very diverse. Like I remember moving into our neighborhood, and we were like one of two Latinx families in our neighborhood. And so then eventually, like Latinx folks just filled up the east side of town here. But I think about not only, as you mentioned, the impact that she has on like second graders, right? Where people are talking about this in class, but even for us before she passed, performing, you know, a Spanish song or dancing to a Spanish song in front of a predominantly like white elementary school, right? And so that's just the level of impact. And I know that when I found out about Salinas' death, like I cried, you know, like I just remember being so hurt and so devastated. And then again, when they made the movie, you know, about her life and death, oh, that was even more devastating. And I can cry about anything. So, I mean, if I start crying now, don't judge me because I'm just emotional as hell all the time.
No.
But yeah, she definitely had an impact. And I think for me, it was like, I remember being this little kid and I was in sixth grade when she died. And I just remember like hearing her English songs on the radio, like on 98.5 out here, right? Which is a radio station that has been around for a really long time. And I just remember thinking like, oh my God, like she's on 98.5. Like it was such a big deal seeing this Chicana, because growing up biculturally, we grew up with, you know, for me, Mexican music, Latinx music, reggaeton, and that was very much part of my identity. But then so was like Tupac and and like, you know, hip hop and things like that. And so knowing that there was someone out there that I could relate to and made it, you know, she was our Beyonce. And I say that all because we often think like, what could have been, right? Like what would she have done with her music career? And so it was very impactful for me personally, but I know just like for you, many Latinx folks, right? Whether first gen, second gen, because based on the series, right, we see that she's more like second gen, third gen. And so, but even then, seeing someone that we can relate to, that we are represented by, was a really big deal. So let's talk about the series, right? The show opens up and there it's like 1971 in Lake Jackson, Texas, where she was born, and it shows her parents. Her mom is in the bed, and dad is, you know, I think holding Selena. And I watched an interview with Suzette Quintanilla, who is her sister and also the producer of the show, and she talked about how it was really a true story, that's how she got her name. And we see that her name means goddess of the moon, and so it goes from there. So we get to learn a little bit more of Selena. And I think just watching the series in general, because I totally binge watched it, right? But watching the series really made me reprocess her death and look at how much of an impact she really had and why, right? I think at the time we were all just really sad that she had passed away, and she was like this. We see how celebrities have an influence on us. Like earlier this year, Kobe, right? How sad that made so many people, and you can just feel energy. So as a little kid, really knowing that we were sad, but not knowing why. And so reprocessing her death really gave me some insight about like, this is someone that I saw, that I connected with in some way. And that way was not only the music, but it was the culture as well. So that scene is followed by another one where her father is teaching AB, the brother, how to play guitar. And then dad catches a whiff of Salinas singing. And she's about 8 years old. And he's like, dude, my daughter's talented, right? So as we're watching the episode, we see a lot of different themes come up. And so one of the themes that came up for me was, familial, which we'll talk about in a second, but also, things like living the American dream. And we see that the family owns a Papagayos restaurant, right? And so the family, they're playing up on the front. And then as soon as they're done playing, dad's like, okay, go bust those tables, right? And so let's dive into that a little bit, because how many first gen, second gen, Latinx families have family businesses that we start, but we're really, invested in sacrificing for the family, right? Sometimes sacrificing school, sacrificing, other things so that we can make it happen for the family when we're struggling. We see that there's a recession. There's some talk about them worrying about, the restaurant closing. And I think in this time that we're in right now, we see a lot of that, right? Where we're kind of going into this recession. It's affecting small businesses. But as Latinx families, we have like some unique issues that influence that, right? We're expected to sacrifice and at times, put our own needs aside for the needs of the whole. And that's what we call familismo, right? So what did you take from that? And I don't know, let me know what you thought about that whole situation with the restaurant and family businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was very real, the emphasis on work, right? And work in a very specific like definition. So we and you can share your experience, but I know for my family, like that life was about like you work hard, and that's usually in a like labor sense, right? Whatever you're doing, you're out there, you're grinding, you're pushing forward to earn money for the family and to keep working, right? And so I think we definitely saw that in the first episode with Abraham being like, "Hey, AB, no, you're done with this part. Now you got to go bust those tables, right?" And it just took me, as you were talking about that scene, back to lots of times when we've had family gatherings. Even I had a very, very small quinceañera, like a backyard kind of thing, and I remember there, and I was still like expected to like, okay, now like go clean up, go do all those things that you need to do. Like this isn't a big moment to like, yes, celebrate, but then also work, right? So it was always interwoven into everything you do. Even now in the conversations, right? It's like, you need to work. That's what you can fall back on, is how much you put into it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that too, there's pressure for us first gen, second gen folks, right? With like putting our dreams aside sometimes to help the family as a whole. We see that with like small businesses. I remember my mom having like starting up a little shop at like the swap meet, and having to go like watch the store, sometimes, and not wanting to be there, but like helping out as much as you could, right? And we see that with other family businesses like restaurants, where you have a family who has a startup and they're trying to make it, but at the same time, everyone has to contribute. One of the episodes shows, and this is more related to like the financial stress, but Selena says like, man, we were supposed to go on a field trip next week, right? Because they're moving, or missing out on certain things that we really want to engage in, because at the same time, we understand the concept of familismo. We understand the concept of loyalty to the family, right? And that's really what familismo is. It's this loyalty to the family, knowing that extended family is going to support you, that you can go to family for support, that they're going to be there to help you. And we saw this even when they're moving to Uncle Hector's house, right? Like, this is what family does, and I appreciate it. And Dad's giving a speech about like, this is what we do for each other. This is how we function. And so we do have times where we had to, make up a bed on the floor and all sleep in a room, right? Like I remember doing that when I was younger, going to my tia's house, and we all made like pallets on the floor, and we're all sleeping in different places, kind of stepping over each other, how we saw, Abraham doing. And so It's tough. And I think one of the other things that, you know, came up for me is how they struggled financially, right? Like they're trying to make it. They have this like family business and there's a recession that's impacting your business and now you're struggling, right? You're struggling to get
Mm.
by, and all along you have this family intact. And so for me, I know that I didn't know we were low income. Like I didn't know we were poor growing up, right?
Mhm.
And so just seeing some of those same struggles, right, that were happening is even makes me relate even more. Understanding that, oh yeah, we had to make some sacrifices for the family too. We had to, you know, kind of contribute to the family business, but at the same time, we didn't really know that we were low income, right? Eventually, we see that they have to close down the restaurant, and
Mhm.
we see the chairs, and they show a for lease sign, right? Um, and so I think in those situations, financial stress is such a big stressor for families, and I think we see that now currently, right? But understanding that how it impacts Latinx families is kind of unique. I don't know what your experience was growing up, but I remember, you know, knowing that I had an intact family and not really thinking that I was missing out on anything until later on. So like AB makes a comment like, "Oh, I want a Mercedes," and he's like, "Oh, maybe one
Mhm.
day, right?"
Mhm.
But for me, it was like nice shoes, right?
Mhm.
And growing up as a first gen meant that my parents came from a little pueblito in Mexico, right, where there was very few resources. In talking with like my grandparents or my parents, even, you know, they didn't even have streetlights until like the 1970s, which is like
Mhm.
what, right? And
Mhm.
we don't really understand how much their culture is influencing our upbringing, but at the same time, how we're also growing up simultaneously in this new culture. And so I go back to like for me it was like shoes and clothes and not being able to like get the shoes that I want because in my parents' mind I imagine like we're doing way better than we were doing in our pueblito, but
Mhm.
still like 40, 50, $60 shoes back then was like outrageous. Right. So I don't know. What did you, how did you interpret that? How did that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience growing up with not knowing, what our economic status was. Um, and I think it was an interesting, like looking back now, it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition of seeing being shielded from some of that through my mom is amazing at sales and finding us something that looked good for the least amount of money.
Yeah.
So we were able to, I think, get what we wanted in a different sense, right? But then pairing that with we were on food stamps growing up, right? And I know in the first episode, there's a lot of shame around that in his family. And you see all of the other families like in line. And I remember I kind of pictured myself in a different way as Selena, the little girl, because I remember going with my mom to the different offices and interpreting for her and kind of playing that role of it. So there was never the shame piece of it because it was so normalized, but also somewhat balanced with we had what we needed. We never asked for anything extravagant. And so again, Christmas we had presents. So there was that kind of dual experience, which was I think interesting. And we saw some of that in that episode and just the role that shame plays when someone, usually the male, feels like they're not being the provider, right? And what that means for that family.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, right? And especially because the shame was coming from Abraham, right? So looking at, I didn't
Mhm.
even think about it from that perspective, but absolutely, like as in our culture, especially like that machismo piece, right, shows up in a lot of different ways, and it's not always negative,
Mhm.
but it absolutely has an impact on like there's some shame associated with not being able to provide, like you said.
Mhm.
I know that in my household, I think part of part of what really helped is my parents knew how to live below their means. And I think growing up in Mexico really help them do that, because living below their means here was living way above their means there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so the little bit that they had here, they made it happen. We never missed out on food or clothing or shelter, because they knew how to live below the means. But I can say I remember, growing up and thinking like there's shame associated with like seeking help or being on food stamps or seeking welfare, right? It's almost like you came here to live this American dream and now you're collecting food stamps. And watching that episode, I thought, man, thank God they like changed it into a debit card, because showing food coupons was even more like adding to the shame, right? Like, here, let me pay you with my food coupons. But you do
Mm-hmm.
see Marcela, her mom, budgeting them, right? And I think that reminded me of like, yes, we learn how to live within our means, and we learn how to make it happen, you know?
Yep.
And that reminds me of like the DIY lamps that they made,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like you said your mom like was really good at like sales and just making things happen. And I think I picked up a lot of that myself too growing up, just like making things look nice. Like I remember I remember my homecoming dress was like $15, and I just made it work. Like if you make it look good, then nobody will know, you spent
Yes.
$15 on your dress at like Fashion Q.
Yes.
But we made it happen. And so just thinking about it was kind of, there was some comedy added to that, where he's like, the lady recognizes Selena at the welfare office. She's like, you're the little things at Papagayos. And he's like, oh, wrong room, right? Like he just
Mm-hmm.
kind of dips out of there. But obviously there's a bunch of factors contributing to that, right? I'm a male, I'm supposed to provide. I'm supposed to make this happen. We had a restaurant, we're supposed to be doing well, but we're
Mm-hmm.
struggling. And so he
Mm-hmm.
gives this speech to Marcela, gives him a speech, and then he gives a speech to the kids, and he's like, "Here, go check out with these food coupons." Um,
Mm-hmm.
but going back to the DIY lamps, right? Like they get this gig, um, and they go and they dumpster dive for these duraznos, these peach cans that either have already been used or some that they threw out because they've been expired.
Mm-hmm.
And you see them making the lamps, but then they're eating the peaches too. And so that really, you think like, oh my God, they're eating expired peaches, but we did that. Like I remember my mom, I'm like, the milk is expired, mom. And she's like, huélalo, like smell it, see if it's still good, right? And
Yep.
if it didn't stink, you were eating that with your cereal, along with other expired foods. And what was your experience with that?
Yeah, no, that's saying no se gasta nada. You don't waste anything, right? You use every part of everything. You reuse, right? I think I saw a meme not too long ago of how Latinos were the first like green people who are like trying to like reuse, and you think about just all the plastic containers and how you use those things three, four,
Yeah.
5 times until you no longer can,
Yeah.
right? And you think about just all of the times, even now, like my mom is very into home decor,
Mhm.
and but she will like buy something, and then whenever it needs changing, she will get spray paint, she will get the craft, she will make it something different. But again, you're not wasting, right? It's not spending money for just the sake of spending it, right? So
Yeah.
I think that has played such a big role, and I think many people relate to that of not trying to live in kind of that wasteful state, which I think a lot of people, it's easy to do that, right? But
Yeah.
growing up, it's like, no, you don't do that. You reuse all the bags from the grocery stores. You reuse those plastic containers so you can never find what actually is in the actual container,
Yeah.
right? So
Butter,
there's all those
salsa.
moments. Yep, you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I really
absolutely.
appreciated that moment with them reusing, right, and not going to waste.
Yeah, I mean, my mom still does that, right? Like she
Hmm.
saves everything, and I think for it was kind of extreme, right? But to some extent, it was like, damn, mom, like you don't have to throw that away anymore. We can buy new reusable cups, like
Yeah.
you know. But absolutely, I think that even that stuck with me, because even now I find myself like not wanting to be wasteful,
Mhm.
and not only for the purpose of being more green, but Absolutely, because that's something that's part of the cultura that just sticks with you, right? Like you grew up where we weren't really, getting rid of much. We were reusing as we could, buying Tupperware sets. We're using the butter. We're using, the tin can of the cookies. We're using it
Mm-hmm.
all.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I definitely think that was they drop because it is the struggle for a lot of Latinx families, right? And even now, like I'm like, if the bun's not molded, like it's still good, Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm still eating it, and I'm like, I could totally buy another loaf of bread, but this has just been ingrained as part of our culture, as part of growing up Latinx, and probably as part of growing up low income, really, and not knowing it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that came up in the series was, Abraham, the dad, decides to make this sacrifice, right? Like everything, the music comes in front of everyone. So we see him move to Uncle Hector's house, and they're all sleeping in the same room. And there's a scene where he's making a trailer so they can carry their equipment. And the brother, Uncle Hector's like, those are some really good skills that you got to put to use, right? And he's like, oh yeah, I'm putting them to use. I'm making stuff for the band. And he says, well, then you can drive a car, you can drive a truck. And he's like, well, if I drive a truck, I'm going to be driving the same truck for 10 years, driving another truck in 10 years, and just keep driving the same truck. Or in 10 years, she could be a star. And Uncle Hector's response is like, dude, you're never gonna change. You and your music, right? And so I think that's the piece where we see this biculturalism kind of really play a role, because we have the valores, we have the value of work and on one side, but then we're also looking at like chasing that American dream, chasing that success or that dream in general, right? And it could be
Mm-hmm.
anything, not just music. Or acting. It can be, being doctors, right? Going to
Mm-hmm.
school, going to college, and being the first to do all these other things. And so his response is like, well, I could drive a truck, but as long as it doesn't interfere, right? As long as it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't interfere. And so we get that initial response from Uncle Hector, like, well, what are you talking about, dude? Like, you should be providing for the family. And so we see that value of work come up again. But then
Mm-hmm.
he switches it up and says, well, so and so's having a wedding, and he gives them a gig. He goes and finds like their first
Yeah.
gig before they make the peach can lamparas. And so I just thought that was really interesting, because I think as first gen folks, we're like the first to become professionals, first college, first to graduate high school, right? And a lot of the times, at least for folks who go to college, um, it can be, the family can see it as like, well, why aren't you just working? Why is this taking so long, right? Like, how long have you been
Mm-hmm.
in school already and you're not making any money? And I know that I heard that at least from my family, right? Where we had there was a conversation, and the conversation was like, damn, well, you've been in school for how long? You could have saved so much money now had you been working all this time. And it just seems like a lot. And so there's so much sacrifice that we have to do, while also trying to juggle these like um, cultural expectations that we
Mm-hmm.
have, you know, working and chasing the American dream, but doing it, like, as you mentioned earlier, through labor, through physical labor.
Mm-hmm.
How did that resonate with you?
Yeah. No. Yes to everything you just said. I, I think in that scene, being honest, I think I had a moment of being with Uncle Hector of like, yeah, why aren't you working? Like, why aren't you putting this into this other? But again, it's from that just narrative I grew up with, right? And I think my family resembled a little bit more maybe of the message that Uncle Hector was sharing, right? Of you put in that work, right? And it, yes, there's these dreams, but if they're not yielding you in the moment what you're wanting, then set those aside and you keep working. So I know for me it was hard. Like it was hard to stick with my education and know that family was not supportive, but not understanding maybe of where I wanted to go. And so their question was always like, you're still in school? Are you still in school? Like, are you done yet? Right. And it takes a while, but I think, and I still don't think they understand completely. And I'm at a point where I understand why. and I respect why, because it's a very different experience, right? So it was nice to see, I think, both of those conversations happening and within the same family. I think that was what was refreshing, of having one person kind of chasing their dream, right? And then having another person having a little bit more of a traditional idea of what that meant, right? But then them coming together at the end and kind of supporting each other because it's family.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I had that same initial reaction, like, dude, your family's homeless right now. Like, you need to be like getting a job. You need to be doing what you can to pay these bills, right? And I think initially there's that reaction, but this is why we're dissecting, the episode, because really when you think about it, it's like, oh man, like I experienced that too. Being in school and having the struggle. And I think many first gen, second gen, Latinx folks do that as well. And I think that's something that we see in like therapy all the time, trying to juggle like these different values that we have, right? While at the same time
Mm-hmm.
setting boundaries, but also, just making sacrifices to get to where we want to end up. And so, yeah, initially I found myself siding with them, but I think that we can also do all the other factors, influencing that conversation or even influencing Abraham, right? Because from a provider perspective, a male perspective, I think we're also, this is how much we're influenced by our own culture. We're also thinking like, dude, like you're supposed to provide, while at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, saying, okay, well, this is where familismo comes in, right? Not only is Uncle Hector helping you out, but now he's plugging you with a gig that, it's gonna get you started. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was also glad to see that they were able to kind of come to a resolution, like, dude, you don't change, but I'm gonna support you. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I thought that was a really awesome thing to kind of have those two perspectives in the same scene. I think that was really awesome. So we'll talk about trust. Trust came up a couple of times in the series, right? Where like Abraham asked his family, "Do you trust your father? Do you trust your father?"
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that, had to do with that masculine perspective, or like, I got to make this happen, but I also need my family on board, right? I also need them to
Mm-hmm.
trust me. Like, I know we're struggling right now, but I'm doing this for a reason. What did you make out of him repeatedly asking, "Do you trust father?"
Yeah, I definitely think I read it as the I have to be the provider sense. And part of it, to me too, kind of looking back on it, is reassuring himself of like, okay, no, like I got this, I got this, right? But
Yeah.
like you said, knowing that you need the family support if it's going to work, right? And I think there was a lot of um, like blind faithfulness that needed to happen, and that thinking back, and this is maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it starts in this episode. We see it throughout, how there's not a ton of transparency between the adults and the children, right? And just thinking about, at least in my personal experience, and I know a lot of like my extended family, there's a clear division of adults and children, and what gets said, what doesn't get said, and the
Yeah.
communication part of that, right? And so I think it showed him, like you were saying earlier, a good depiction of what a like second gen family might experience, of someone trying to open it up a little bit, but still keeping that distance, right? And keeping it very much separate of like, this is my responsibility. The whole family is my responsibility. So there's a lot of pressure in that, right? And I think it made me a little sympathize a little bit more with Abraham versus seeing him as maybe a little bit more like strict or controlling. It made me feel like the pressure he feels.
Yeah. What do you think about? I mean, you bring up a really good point about how like there was, like, I know what my dad is doing, but I really don't know what he's doing, because there's an episode where, I mean, a scene where they're playing at this like fair, right? And then the guy's like, "Oh, thanks so much," and he pays them and he gives them like a stack of
Mhm.
fives, right? And then all of a sudden, AB Junior comes up and he's like, Can we get something to eat now? And he basically hands him over like almost the entire chunk of cash that he got. And so
Mhm.
we see that struggle of like trying to make ends meet, trying to stay afloat, right? Trying to make things happen, but at the same time, a lot of sacrificing. And I know that that was something, I think it's something common in a lot of Latinx households where we don't really include our kids in what's going on. But I also think that that has a negative impact on kids, right? We don't see a lot of that on the show, but I think for us growing up, at least for me, you know, and now having my own kids, like I think about now how I'm more transparent with my kids. I choose to be more open and talk to them about certain things, right? And it extends beyond like the financial status of the family, but just things in
Mhm.
general. There's so many things that calladitos se ven más bonitos, right? Like you just sit in the corner, be quiet, and mind your own business, or stay in your child's place. And I hate that because it really minimizes our kids, right? It almost
Mhm.
sends a message that you're not on the same level as me, and you're not, you know, you're on a need to know basis, and you don't need to know, right? And obviously
Mhm.
some things we want to, you know, be mindful about what we talk about in front of our kids, but at the same time, like knowing that there are things that are very anxiety provoking to kids, right? Like um, relocating schools. We
Mhm.
see Suzette talking about, you know, what about me? Like, I have all my friends here and she's a teenager. So, knowing that, you know, as a clinician, knowing that relocations, whether it's school and a home relocation, can cause a lot of distress. It can impact, you know, academic functioning and things like that. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, we do see this lack of communication, which I think is very common among Latinx folks and Latinx families. But how do you see that, you know, coming into, I see that in the therapy room quite often, right? Like trying to navigate that and trying to figure out what is it, even in my own therapy, like when is it okay to talk to my kid about this, right?
Mhm.
What do you think about that?
So I work at a non-for-profit medical clinic, integrated care, and so we do therapy for whoever our patients are. And most of the patients I see are recent immigrants from Mexico, anywhere from like a year. They've only been in the US a year to 20, 30 years, right? So it's a big range. But what I see often though is that parent child struggle, right? Dealing with like acculturation, dealing with not understanding some of the maybe American values that the kids are wanting to adopt or are like drawn to for various reasons. And so I see that struggle often of parents not understanding the children and not understanding where to go with it, right? Not understanding how to talk to them. Is it can they talk to them, right? So a lot of the work I feel like that I have done is in trying to open those spaces to offer conversation, right? It's like just start with attempting a conversation, and even that can create such a space for healing and for understanding and to go around all the behavioral issues that come from this in-betweenness that a lot of us first gen, second gen folks feel, right? Because you're not rooted in either space entirely, and it feels like you're not. I'll speak for myself. Feels like growing up, it felt like I wasn't like ni de aquí ni de allá, right? That common saying of neither from here or
Yeah.
from there. And so getting, I think the parents to just have a little bit of that insight into that experience, I think can be extremely helpful.
Yeah, because it causes conflict, right? Like I think growing up biculturally can cause a lot of conflict in the home because there is that lack of understanding. There's like that missing piece that parents aren't necessarily grasping because this isn't how they grew up, right? Like they grew up for at least for my parents, right? They grew up in a little town in Durango, Mexico, and you know where everyone knew everybody, right? Like I remember being a little girl and going to like visit my grandparents in Mexico, And I would go to like the little corner store and they'd be like, oh, you're so-and-so's daughter, just
Mhm.
off of looks, right? Like that's how much people knew each other. And then we come here and there's a total shift, right? You have this extended family and this interconnectedness, this familismo. And then here you come to this country where you're supposed to be independent. You're supposed to, find your dreams and, chase them and reach your goals and do all these other things. But there's also different cultural factors that come into play that I think cause a lot of conflict. So I think for me, that was not only my parents not understanding why I wanted to go hang out with my friends or why my friendships were important, um, but really getting them to understand like this is normal behavior here. This isn't like out of the norm. And so I think that was difficult. And I know that I've been on this journey, right? Like uh, it takes a really long time to realize who you are. And I'm, as you mentioned, I'm still on my decolonization journey, and I think we're all in like different places with our identity, but I'm not really sure that I can say I was comfortable being my authentic self until like a few years ago, right? Where
Mhm.
we're constantly developing this identity, and even growing up here has some negative aspects to it, right? In terms of like what we grow up thinking professional looks like, what a psychologist looks like, what a business owner looks like, how a business owner talks, what kind of music they listen to, right? And really dimming our own light because of these ideas and ideals that we've come up with. And so growing up bicultural was really difficult looking, in retrospect. So
Mhm.
did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you had mentioned earlier too, like with Suzette and the changing schools, right? So moving from Chicago to Texas or San Antonio down south, it I was in that like 7, 8 years old, third grade, and that was honestly just speaking to the difference in culture. In Chicago, the neighborhoods there are very segregated, and so where I lived was primarily Mexican American, and so that was my world. That's what I knew. I didn't know other people existed really. It was like that's all I saw.
Yeah.
Corner stores, people speaking Spanish, like that was just common. And then in Texas, there's the Texas culture. I think is unique. I've grown to love it. I say y'all now, and it's a very much a part of my identity. But there is, I think, an unspoken hierarchy among the minority populations there, right? And so a lot of times there's this, and again, this is generalizing, but that was the first time where I experienced racism from someone who looked like me, right? Because I was a kid speaking Spanish and someone called me a slur, and I looked at her and I was you're brown like me. What's happening here,
Yeah.
right? And not really understanding it. And so that I think further complicated it with not being not feeling American, not feeling Mexican, and now I'm in this place where there's this kind of third culture where I'm like, oh, maybe I fit here, and you don't, right? Or I didn't feel like I did at that time, and so I think a lot of kids who end up relocating for various reasons and thinking about just the families that I worked with here in Las Vegas, there are a lot of families who have had to move for financial reasons. And even if you're just moving neighborhoods in Las Vegas, that can create a big identity shift depending what school you go to, right? So being aware, I think, of that is super important, something that I think needs further conversation.
So growing up biculturally, I think that music is a big influence on us. Like I can have days where I go from like Jenny Rivera and Selena and Banda to other days where I'm like Beyonce, Tupac, Jay-Z, Nipsey Hussle, right?
Mhm.
And growing up, I think that having this strong Mexican identity was hard because acculturation is so important to Latinx mental health. And I know there's like research on, the more you acculturate, the less likely you are to experience depression and anxiety and things like that. And so it's a very difficult, I guess, journey because for me it was like Mexican music sounds funky to my friends. Like it sounds weird, right? Like,
Mhm.
and at the same time, I have this like really like strong identity, and people are looking at you like y'all dance funny, like your music is funny, like right. And but at the same time, me loving that aspect of my culture, while simultaneously also loving American culture. And so I think that that's why I think it takes us so long to reach this like this point in our lives where we're like, okay, this is my identity, this is who I am, and I can be my authentic self. In talking about culturalism, going back to like Selena and like Suzette, we see, you know, how important friendships are, and I just don't think that my parents really understood that, right? So again, leaving us in kind of in wondering like what's going on, but at the same time, like there's things that I think come working with Latinx families where there's so many things that are still taboo, right? Like we don't talk to our kids about, from things, you know, from sex to your menstrual period to whatever the case is.
Mhm.
If your parents didn't grow up and their parents were talking about this, chances are that they weren't talking to you about it. And so
Mhm.
while I definitely think that there's certain things like financial, you know, economic status and all these things that you probably don't need to stress your children about, are things that come up like biculturalism and other things that I think are important to talk to kiddos about.
Mhm. Mental health, right? Like that's I think I remember having a moment with my mom as an adult, of wanting to again erase the stigma with mental health and Latinx folks. And I had gone through a pretty bad period of depression and anxiety, and was finally able to kind of use tools, seek help, and do all that. And I had a moment with my mom of like, oh, this is the perfect time for me to tell her, like, there was an incident, I was feeling anxious. I was like, let me tell her about that. And I mentioned it. And again, it was very like soft and sort of like, oh, I was anxious, right?
Yeah.
And then she had this like small deer in the headlights moment and was like, okay. And conversation went a different way. It's like, I'm gonna leave it because it's not ready, but there's a little seed planted, right? So with all of the things you mentioned and mental health and emotions, like being able to plant these seeds for folks who are seeking space to talk about it, and it's all okay, it's all normal. We just need to create that space, right?
Yeah. And I think this will definitely come up later on in the series when we're discussing other episodes, right? Like how stress impacts, you know, the family and how it starts to trickle down and how we're really not talking, we're not having these open conversations about mental health. And we know how much stress is a contributing factor in anxiety and in depression, but nonetheless, it's not talked about. And so I'm excited to dissect the other episodes with you as well. So towards the end of the first episode, we see that, you know, Abraham realizes after doing a gig at the fair, and he's like talking with Marcela, and she's like, you know, music in Espanol is just so much more romantic. And they decide, he's like, light bulb goes off and they need to sing Tejano music in Spanish. And so
Mhm.
he's in the car with Selena and Suzette, and they're listening to the radio station, and there's like English music playing, and he changes it, and they're like, dude, what are you doing? And so he starts having this conversation with her about, you know, her having both identities, because she's like, I'm American, and he's like, but you're also Mexican. You have the two cultures inside of you.
Mhm.
And he's asking her to basically sing in Spanish, even though she doesn't know how to speak Spanish. And so even though I think that Selena is not first gen, right? Well, we know she's not first gen. We don't know if she's second or third gen. Language and bilingualism is another issue, right? That comes up. And for me, you know, Spanish was my first language. I was in ESL classes when I lived in LA, and I didn't get exposed to English until, you know, I went to school.
Mhm.
And so we know, you know, based on research, that it takes like 5 years for someone to fully develop the language, right? She learned it through music, but I also think like even though there's so many different levels of in within the umbrella of bilingualism, because for me, you know, I have parents who don't have a high level of education, who, you know, taught me the Spanish that they knew, right? This is the slang Spanish or the Espanol that you talk about in your household, right? And some of the words aren't even real. Like when you start to realize what, you know, proper professional Spanish is. And so for me, you know, having this identity of Spanish is my first language, and you know, I have patients all the time who are like, how do you know Spanish so good, right? Like, because I speak it like my mom speaks it. But being in this field has also taught me that I really don't know fucking Spanish. I don't know it. You know, I don't know the professional Spanish. And I've been asked to, like, you know, speak, whether it's on a podcast or like do a news segment. And I find myself having to like Google things or having to like reteach myself, you know, the proper way of saying something. Like, there's no such thing as a parqueadero, right? Like, es un estacionamiento, like estacionamiento. Like, it's not necessarily like, these are words that we got from parking and made it parqueadero, right? Like, that's not how you speak, you know, in a professional manner. And so we see her like taking on this language and, you know, starting to sing the music in Spanish, and even learns it because she sounds awesome. Her accent is like on point. But what was that like for you? You know, I know on the flip side, we have other Latinx folks who identify as Mexican and aren't necessarily Spanish speaking. And I think we get that pushback too from the culture, right? Where it's like, well, you're not really Mexican if you don't speak Spanish, but that's not true, right? Because there's so many levels within the spectrum of bilingualism. So what was your take on that?
Yeah, I love what you ended with there, because I think that's where I finally reached that point of not being ashamed of whatever Spanish I speak, right? I think me and language have had a journey, honestly. And I used to be, I think, really, as a kid, same first language growing up. My mom only spoke Spanish. So in the home, that's what we spoke. School, that's where I learned English. I have an older brother, so, you know, language, I think, developed a little more quickly there. But it wasn't until, again, somebody pointed out, like, why are you speaking Spanish? That I was like, oh, I didn't know this was not a thing that everybody did. And I kind of reverted the complete opposite way. And there was a lot of shame in using Spanish outside of the home, right? And same, there's kind of the Spanish del rancho that we kind of spoke. And so when I was in grad school, when I was in grad school, that's when I was really interested in providing therapy for Spanish-speaking folks. And that's also when I was like, oh, I don't know if I know Spanish anymore. And that journey, I think, was, again, just that inner conflict, that inner uncertainty of, who am I? Like, am I enough for this language, for that language? And through, I think, working with folks and seeing the appreciation that people have for, one, just attempting, right? Like, you're trying to connect with me in a way that others haven't.
Right.
Finding so much value in that, and finding, I think, my own kind of voice and confidence through that, to where I don't have an accent when I speak again, because I grew up speaking it. But there are words that I'm like, I don't know what that is, right? So Google is a friend. But I think reaching that point of, there's no right or wrong way to be in whatever identity you identify, right? So as Mexican American, there's not a certain level you need to be at, or that's correct, right? And there's so much freedom when you reach that point. But I don't think those conversations, again, happen enough to where people still don't feel shame around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's a lot of historical context that, you know, can help explain some of that pushback that, you know, in some parts of the country where it's like, really, you should be ashamed of speaking Spanish. We're in America, you know, whatever the case is. But I also think that comes from a historical place where before we were literally like punished for speaking Spanish, right? Like, people were really fearful of being heard speaking Spanish. And so that was almost a survival mechanism. And that goes back to like the third, fourth, fifth generation, you know, Latinx folks. And then you have like the first gen, second gen folks who are like, oh, you don't speak Spanish, then you're not that Mexican, or you're not really Mexican. And so going back and forth and then finding out that, damn, Spanish is my first language, but I don't know real professional Spanish, right? I know Español de rancho, like you said, right? And that's my thing. And I can totally get down on that. So whenever we do these Spanglish episodes or these Spanish episodes, please forgive me in advance because I'm gonna royally mess some things up, right? Like, and I think that there is that appreciation though of you're trying, right? You're still trying to communicate, you're still trying to convey the message and trying to erase the stigma. So Dr. Mejia, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to dissecting the other episodes with you and really diving into some of the mental health implications that come along or come up in some of those episodes. And then in the future, looking at other series like Gentified or Gentified, which is an awesome series if you haven't watched it. I don't think that the new season's coming out until like sometime late next year or 2022 even because of the pandemic. But I am absolutely looking forward to not only this episode, but all the future episodes. So tell us where folks can find you. I know we put it on the little ticker there, but where can we find you? Where can folks follow you?
Yeah, thank you. This awesome conversation that I think will dive more deep into some of those very specific things that influence all of us, right? So you can follow me on Instagram at Salud Psychology. So it's Salud, SALUD Psychology. And again, you can reach out through there, trying to build more content and it's all, like you're saying, Spanish, Spanglish, English, just to reach as many people and to continue to spread that acceptance of mental health, of feelings, emotions, like it's all valid. So thank you for the work you do and for starting this conversation.
Thank you. We're all, erasing the stigma in our own way. So trying to not only spread the word, but educate folks and, try talking folks into being more open to mental health services and having these conversations at home. So thank you. You can find me you can find us at Borrando el Estigma on Instagram as well. It's borrando_el_estigma. You can also hit me up at dr.sandra.gray on Instagram. And if you like this episode, follow us. You can also listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other platforms that you can listen podcasts to. So thank you so much again, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.